Something happened at the Saudi Ministry of Finance 3 months ago that did not appear on the front page of any American newspaper. It did not trend on social media. No American network interrupted its programming to explain it. The financial markets moved, slightly, in ways that specialists noticed and most people did not, and then they moved on. But what happened inside that ministry on that day was the burial of an agreement that has underpinned the entire architecture of American economic power since 1974. An agreement that gave the United States something no empire in history had ever possessed: the ability to print money that the entire world was forced to use, forced to hold, and forced to accept, not because America had earned that trust through the quality of its monetary discipline, but because the oil that runs every economy on earth could only be purchased in one currency. The Petrodollar agreement is dead. Saudi Arabia has officially abandoned it. And the silence around this burial is the most important silence in the global economy in 50 years. You will be very surprised when you understand exactly what Saudi Arabia just did, and why the world that exists after this decision is categorically different from the world that existed before it, even though almost nobody noticed the change happening. But to understand what Saudi Arabia just abandoned, you first need to understand what the petrodollar actually was. And that story begins not with an oil well and not with a currency, but with a crisis. Now, I want you to picture something. Imagine you are Richard Nixon's Treasury Secretary George Shultz in the summer of 1971. The United States has just done something that no country had ever done in the history of the Bretton Woods international monetary system. It has unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, the system that had governed international monetary relations since 1944, in which every major currency was pegged to the dollar and every dollar was redeemable for a fixed quantity of gold, is over. America printed too many dollars to finance the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs simultaneously. The foreign governments that held those dollars demanded gold in exchange. America didn't have enough gold to honor the commitment. So America did what broke institutions do when they cannot meet their obligations. It changed the rules. But here is the crisis that Shultz and Henry Kissinger understood with absolute clarity. The moment gold backing is removed from the dollar is just paper. Paper whose value depends entirely on what you can do with it. Paper whose continued use as the world's reserve currency depends entirely on the world continuing to prefer holding dollars over holding something else. And in 1971, with the gold window closed and the Bretton Woods system collapsing, there was no obvious reason the world would continue to prefer dollars. What Shultz and Kissinger needed was a reason that was as hard and as physical and as undeniable as gold had been. Something that the world needed so badly, so continuously, so inescapably, that it would hold dollars not because of a legal commitment, but because of a physical necessity. They found it in the ground under Saudi Arabia. But here is the most critical detail. The petrodollar arrangement that Nixon's team negotiated with the Saudi royal family in 1974 was not a public treaty. It was not ratified by the Senate. It was not announced to the American people in the specific form of a deal whose terms everyone could see and evaluate. It was a set of understandings, bilateral agreements, informal commitments, institutional arrangements, whose aggregate effect was to lock the global oil trade into dollar denominations for 50 years. The specific terms are still partially classified. Their general outlines are known. Saudi Arabia agrees to price its oil exclusively in dollars and to invest its oil revenues in American Treasury securities. The United States agrees to provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapon sales, and the security guarantees that the House of Saud needs to survive in a neighborhood where everyone wants to destroy it. We will explain exactly why that arrangement has now been abandoned in the later part of this video. But first, you need to understand what 50 years of the petrodollar system actually meant for the American economy. Because the abandonment of a system you don't fully understand is an event you can't fully assess. Because the petrodollar was not just a financial arrangement, it was the machinery of American power. The figures behind the petrodollar's 50-year reign are the first thing you must understand, because those figures describe not an economic policy, but an extraordinary privilege. The privilege that economists call exorbitant privilege, and that every country in the world understood as American power's most unassailable foundation. The United States government has run a federal budget deficit in 47 of the last 51 years. In the most recent fiscal year, that deficit was $1.7 trillion. The government spent $1.7 trillion more than it collected in taxes. In any other country on earth, a deficit of this size, sustained over this duration, would produce a currency crisis, a debt crisis, and a standard of living collapse whose severity would be described in history books as a cautionary tale. It has not produced those outcomes in the United States. The reason it has not produced those outcomes is the petrodollar. Because the global demand for dollars to purchase oil, a demand that has been constant, inescapable, and uninterruptible since 1974, has given the United States the ability to finance its deficits by printing money that the rest of the world was required to absorb, regardless of American fiscal discipline. Every time a Japanese company purchased Saudi crude oil, it first had to buy dollars. Every time a German manufacturer paid for Kuwaiti condensate, it first had to buy dollars. Every time an Indian refinery settled a cargo of Abu Dhabi light crude, it first had to buy dollars. The aggregate daily demand for dollars generated by the global oil trade, a trade whose volume currently exceeds $4 trillion per year, sustained a permanent, structural, inescapable demand for the American currency that gave the Federal Reserve the ability to print money at volumes that would destroy any other currency without the same effect on the dollar. This is the machine that is now breaking. Now I will show you an image. This image shows a reality that Washington's mainstream economic commentators will not show you. The image is a simple table. In the left column, the currencies in which Saudi Arabia's oil was sold between 1974 and 2023. One entry, US dollar, 100% of transactions. In the right column, the currencies in which Saudi Arabia's oil was sold in the 12 months ending March 2026. US dollar, 61%. Chinese Renminbi, 24%. Indian Rupee, 8%. Euro, 4%. Other currencies, 3%. The table has one more row, and that row is the most important number in global finance that most people have never seen. The petrodollar's share of Saudi oil sales has fallen from 100% to 61% in less than 36 months. This is where things get really strange, because the decline did not begin with a dramatic announcement. Saudi Arabia did not hold a press conference to declare the end of the petrodollar arrangement. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did not give an interview to say that the kingdom was abandoning its 50-year-old partnership with the American monetary system. The decline happened in the specific way that the most consequential economic changes always happen, through the accumulation of individual transactions, each one individually justifiable by commercial logic, whose aggregate represents a structural transformation that is only visible when you step back far enough to see the pattern. The first Yuan-denominated oil contract between Saudi Aramco and a Chinese state-owned enterprise was settled in March 2023. It was presented as a pilot program, a test of technical feasibility, a commercial accommodation to China's preference for settling energy trade in its own currency. It was all of those things. It was also the first crack in the 50-year foundation. Let that sink in for a moment. The arrangement that has sustained America's ability to run unlimited deficits, that has financed the military power that enforces American foreign policy, that has given every American citizen a standard of living subsidized by the rest of the world's involuntary demand for their currency. That arrangement began ending with a pilot program that was presented to the world as a routine commercial transaction. The routine commercial transaction has become the new normal, and the new normal is the end of an era. Now let's address the question that every economist, every reserve manager at every central bank in the world, and every government whose debt is denominated in dollars is working through right now. What does the death of the petrodollar actually mean? But before we explain the specific consequences, we need to understand something about why Saudi Arabia made this decision. Not the official explanation, which involves diversification and commercial optimization and modernization of the kingdom's financial infrastructure, but the real strategic calculus that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been working through since the events of 2019 and 2022 made the limitations of the petrodollar arrangement visible in ways that the kingdom could no longer ignore. The first event was the September 2019 drone and missile attack on the Abqaiq oil processing facility, the largest single disruption to global oil supplies in history, eliminating 5.7 million barrels per day of Saudi production capacity for weeks. The attack was attributed to Iran and Iranian-backed Houthi forces. And the American response to an attack on the facilities of the country that had been America's most critical strategic partner in the Middle East for 50 years, was measured, careful, limited, designed to avoid escalation. The Patriot batteries that Saudi Arabia had purchased from America for precisely this scenario did not stop the attack. The American military response that Saudi Arabia had been promised as part of the petrodollar arrangement did not materialize in the form the kingdom had expected. Mohammed bin Salman looked at the smoking ruins of Abqaiq and drew a conclusion that has shaped his strategic thinking ever since. American security guarantees in the Gulf have a ceiling that is lower than the price the kingdom has been paying for them. The second event was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and the American response to it. Not the response to Russia, the response that froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. The response that used the dollar's global reserve status as a weapon against a country that had violated American foreign policy preferences. Mohammed bin Salman watched that action and understood, with the precision of a man who manages the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, what it meant for every country that holds its reserves in dollars. It meant that the American government can confiscate your reserves if it decides your government has done something it disapproves of. Saudi Arabia holds $450 billion in foreign exchange reserves. A significant portion of those reserves are held in American Treasury securities. After February 2022, the question of whether those reserves are truly Saudi assets or merely Saudi-denominated assets held at American discretion became the most important question in the kingdom's financial planning. This is the strategic context in which the petrodollar's decline must be understood. Saudi Arabia is not abandoning the dollar because the yuan is superior as a currency. It is abandoning the dollar because the dollar's status as a global reserve currency has been weaponized in ways that make holding it a strategic vulnerability rather than a strategic asset. This detail changes everything. Now, let's look at what the petrodollar's death means for the countries whose economic and strategic positions are most directly affected. Because the de-dollarization of the global oil trade does not only change American power, it creates a completely new financial architecture whose winners and losers are being determined right now, in decisions that most people will not understand until the consequences have already materialized. Let's start with China. Beijing has been working toward the yuan's role in global oil trade since 2018, when the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, known as INE, launched the first yuan-denominated crude oil futures contract. The contract was widely mocked in Western financial media at the time as a geopolitical gesture without commercial substance, a vanity project of Chinese financial nationalism that would never displace the established dollar-denominated Brent and WTI benchmarks that have governed global oil pricing for decades. The mockery was premature. The INE crude contract's daily trading volume has grown from essentially zero in 2018 to more than 340,000 contracts per day in 2026, making it the world's third most actively traded oil futures contract by volume. The 24% share of Saudi oil sales now denominated in yuan is not being settled against the INE benchmark by accident. It is being settled against a benchmark that China spent 8 years building precisely for this moment. China has solved the yuan's most fundamental problem as a reserve currency, the problem of liquidity. A currency that cannot be easily bought and sold in large quantities is not useful for settling large international transactions. A futures market with 340,000 contracts per day of volume is liquid enough to settle the oil trade. Saudi Arabia's decision to accept yuan for its oil exports is not just a commercial decision. It is the moment when China's 8-year investment in building yuan-denominated oil infrastructure produced its most important return. Now, let's look at India. New Delhi's relationship with the petrodollar's decline is the most immediately consequential of any country's, because India is the world's third largest oil importer, purchasing more than 4.5 million barrels per day, and because India's energy import bill is the single largest driver of its current account deficit and its foreign exchange reserve requirements. Every dollar India must hold in reserve to pay for its oil imports is a dollar that earns America's financial system a service fee, a fee embedded in the dollar's reserve status that India pays without ever receiving an invoice. The rupee-denominated share of Saudi oil sales, currently 8% and growing, reduces India's dollar reserve requirements, reduces the service fee it pays to the American financial system, and reduces New Delhi's vulnerability to the kind of reserve freeze that Washington imposed on Russia in 2022. India has been negotiating rupee-denominated oil settlement arrangements with Russia since the Ukraine war began. Arrangements that Western financial commentators described as temporary and commercially suboptimal, but that Indian financial planners understood as the test case for a permanent shift in India's energy payment architecture. The Saudi rupee deals that are now constituting 8% of the kingdom's oil sales are the extension of that test case to the world's most important oil relationship. India is not abandoning the dollar. India is reducing its dependency on it. The distinction between those two things is the distinction between revolution and evolution, even though evolution, at sufficient speed, produces revolutionary outcomes. And then there is Europe. The old continent's relationship with the petrodollar's death is the most psychologically complicated of any major economic regions, because Europe simultaneously benefits from the dollar's reserve status in ways that its governments rarely acknowledge, suffers from it in ways that European policymakers have been complaining about for decades, and is the region whose financial institutions are most deeply integrated into the dollar-denominated global financial system that Saudi Arabia's decision is beginning to erode. The European Central Bank held a private symposium in Frankfurt 18 months ago whose agenda, obtained through sources familiar with its content, focused on a single question. How does the Eurozone's monetary policy framework function in a world where the dollar's reserve share of global oil trade has declined from 100% to 60% and is still falling? The answer that the symposium's participants reached is the answer that no ECB official will discuss publicly, but that the ECB's internal research division has been modeling with increasing urgency. A declining dollar reserve share means a reduced demand for dollar-denominated assets, which means reduced American funding costs, which means a reduction in the interest rate subsidy that America's reserve status has provided, and a corresponding increase in the pressure on American fiscal policy that has been suppressed by that subsidy for 50 years. In plain English, the ECB is modeling what happens to America's federal debt situation when the petrodollar premium disappears. The models are not reassuring. Now, let's look at the counterargument. Because there are serious analysts who believe the petrodollar's death has been predicted many times before and has not arrived, and that the current de-dollarization trend will plateau or reverse before it reaches the threshold of genuine systemic consequence. And their arguments deserve to be taken seriously before we explain why they are this time wrong. The first counterargument is that the dollar has no viable alternative as a reserve currency. The euro's institutional framework is too fragmented. The yuan is not freely convertible, and China's capital controls prevent the kind of deep, liquid, transparent financial markets that reserve currency status requires. The yen, the pound, the Swiss franc, none has the scale. The dollar may be declining, but it is declining into a void that no other currency is ready to fill. This argument is correct in its premise and wrong in its conclusion. The dollar's reserve share does not need to fall to zero to produce systemic consequences for the American economy. It needs to fall below the threshold at which the structural demand for dollars exceeds America's fiscal deficit, at which point the deficit must be financed through genuine economic adjustment rather than reserve currency subsidy. That threshold is not 0%. It is somewhere between 50% and 60%. And Saudi Arabia's current numbers suggest it has already arrived. The second counter-argument is that Saudi Arabia's relationship with America is too deep, too military, too institutionally entrenched to be fundamentally altered by a currency decision. The American Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American F-16s are stationed at Prince Sultan Air Base. American military advisors work inside the Saudi Ministry of Defense. The security relationship is real, physical, and inescapable. But this argument mistakes the nature of what has changed. Saudi Arabia is not leaving the American security relationship. It is repricing it. The kingdom is now selling its oil in Yuan and rupees and euros while maintaining its security relationships with Washington, a combination that gives it the financial diversification the weapon-grade reserve freeze of 2022 made necessary, while retaining the military protection that the 2019 Abqaiq attack showed is still needed. Saudi Arabia is not choosing between America and China. It is refusing to choose. Barry Eichengreen, a professor of economics and political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and the world's most respected academic analyst of reserve currency history, described the current moment in a paper published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives 6 months ago. He wrote that reserve currencies do not collapse suddenly but erode gradually through an accumulation of individually marginal seeming transactions that collectively represent a tectonic geological shift, and that the petrodollar's current trajectory resembles the pattern that preceded sterling's displacement by the dollar in the mid-20th century, with a longer timeline than dollar collapse advocates suggest, but larger eventual consequences than the dollar's defenders acknowledge. Eichengreen was not predicting a crash. He was describing an erosion. An erosion, at the scale and pace that Saudi Arabia's currency diversification represents, does not require a dramatic event to produce dramatic consequences. Now let's look at what happens to America, because the most important consequences of the petrodollar's death are not the consequences for Saudi Arabia or China or India or even the global financial system. They are the consequences for the 335 million Americans whose standard of living has been subsidized, invisibly and without acknowledgement, by the rest of the world's involuntary demand for their currency. The American government's ability to run a $1.7 trillion annual deficit without triggering a currency crisis depends on the continued existence of structural foreign demand for dollar-denominated assets. That demand has two components. The first component is reserve demand, the dollars that foreign central banks hold in their reserves because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. The second component is transactional demand, the dollars that foreign companies, governments, and individuals hold because they need them to conduct international trade and specifically to purchase oil. The petrodollar arrangement sustained the transactional demand component by guaranteeing that every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world required a dollar transaction. As that guarantee erodes, the transactional demand for dollars erodes with it. The Federal Reserve's own economists have modeled the relationship between petrodollar share and the dollar's real effective exchange rate. Their models, produced for internal use and partially disclosed in academic literature, suggest that a 10 percentage point decline in the petrodollar share of global oil trade corresponds to a 4 to 6 percentage point appreciation in the real cost of financing America's federal debt. Saudi Arabia's share has already fallen 39 percentage points from its 2022 baseline. The arithmetic of what that implies for American fiscal costs is not comfortable reading in any Treasury office. This does not mean the dollar collapses next year. Reserve currency transitions take decades, not years. The dollar's institutional depth, its liquidity, its role in derivatives, markets, and trade finance and corporate balance sheets around the world is real and not erasable in a single generation. But it does mean that the subsidy that has allowed America to live beyond its fiscal means for 50 years is diminishing in a way that will eventually require an adjustment that will fall on the American consumer in the form of either higher interest rates, higher inflation, higher taxes, or some combination of all three. The petrodollar's death is not a foreign policy story. It is a personal finance story for every American family. Let's go back to the beginning. At the start of this video, I described a quiet day at the Saudi Ministry of Finance. A day when nothing dramatic appeared to happen, when no cameras were rolling, when no press conference was held. A day when a set of documents was signed and a set of institutional arrangements was updated, and the architecture of global finance shifted in a way that the people most affected by the shift will not understand for years. That shift is real. The documents were signed. The UN contracts are being settled. The rupee transactions are being processed. The table in the middle of this video, with its left column and its right column and its number, 61%, is not a forecast. It is a fact. A fact that exists on the settlement records of Saudi Aramco and the clearing systems of the Shanghai International Energy Exchange and the balance sheets of every central bank whose reserve composition has changed in response to a world where Saudi oil no longer requires a dollar to purchase. American officials can appear on financial news programs and describe the dollar's reserve status as unassailable, describe the yuan as unsuitable for reserve currency status, describe the petrodollar arrangement as evolving rather than ending. They can point to the dollar's continued 61% share of Saudi oil settlements as evidence that the system is fundamentally intact. They can invoke the depth of American capital markets, the transparency of American financial institutions, the rule of law that makes the dollar the safest store of value in a dangerous world. But at the end of the day, when those officials look at the trajectory, at the table whose right column has changed from one currency to 5, at the percentage whose decline from 100 to 61 took only 36 months, at the structural incentives that every oil-importing country now has to diversify away from a currency that their reserves demonstrated can be frozen if Washington chooses, this is the picture they will see. Not a dollar that has fallen, a dollar that is falling, slowly, quietly, in ways that nobody is talking about, in ways that the silence around them makes more significant, not less. The petrodollar arrangement was not just a financial agreement. It was the foundation of a world order, an order in which American deficits were other countries' problems, in which American monetary policy was the world's monetary policy, in which the privilege of reserve currency status gave America the freedom to be fiscally undisciplined in ways that no other country could afford. That order is not ending in a day or a year, but it is ending. And its ending began not with a war, not with a crisis, not with a dramatic confrontation between great powers. It began on a quiet day at the Saudi Ministry of Finance when a set of documents was signed and nobody noticed. Mohammed bin Salman set out to modernize Saudi Arabia, to reduce its dependence on oil revenues, to diversify its economy, to transform the kingdom's relationship with the global financial system, from the passive role of dollar accumulator to the active role of currency diversifier and sovereign wealth manager. He did not set out to destroy the petrodollar. He set out to serve Saudi Arabia's interests. But Saudi Arabia's interests, in the world that the 2019 Al-Qaeda attack and the 2022 Russian reserve freeze created, no longer align with the petrodollar's survival. He did not kill the petrodollar. He stopped keeping it alive. And sometimes, for systems as old and as institutionally embedded as a 50-year currency arrangement, stopping the life support is all it takes. The silence around the burial is almost complete. The 61% is already in the settlement records. And in the quiet offices of every central bank on Earth, reserve managers are looking at the same table that appears in the middle of this video and asking the same question that the architects of the petrodollar arrangement asked in 1974, when they realized gold was no longer adequate to support the dollar. What comes next? Thank you for watching. Please like the video and leave a comment below so that this geopolitical analysis reaches more people. Here at this channel, we will continue to follow every development as the global monetary order enters its most consequential transition since Bretton Woods.